Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Our today's session is a continuation of volume 1 of the novel Emma. We will talk about the text, story, and we will do a critical analysis. Before I move forward, I would like to share a review of the previous session. In the previous session, we covered first 8 chapters of volume 1. We talked about important happenings in these chapters and important points of discussion. Relevant and important parts of text with reference to the development of characters, plot, and structure were also discussed. Jane Austen as a writer and her art of characterization was discussed with reference to these first 8 chapters. We also saw how different themes were developed through these chapters. Well, as far as today's session is concerned, this session will cover chapters 9 to 18 of volume 1. Thus, by the end of today's session, we would have covered volume 1. Important happenings in these chapters, that is from chapter 9 to 18, would be covered in today's session. Points of critical analysis and discussion would be highlighted. Important parts of text with reference to the development of characters, plot, and structure would also be discussed. I would also talk about Jane Austen as a writer and her art of characterization, and of course, following the same pattern as we had in the previous session, we would look at the development of different themes through these chapters. So, we are starting with chapter 9 of volume 1. What we notice in this chapter is that another misunderstanding is generated due to some actions. Mr. Elton gives Emma a poem that she assumes is intended for Harriet. When the poem or the riddle, actually the riddle is in the form of a poem, sorry, actually se shuru karenge. Actually, the riddle is in the form of a poem, so when the riddle is deciphered, it is clearly a love poem. This leads to another misunderstanding, as Emma believes the poem shows Mr. Elton's intentions towards Harriet. She continues to advise Harriet on romantic matters, specifically telling her to not be betrayed by her feelings for Mr. Elton. This is a further development as Mr. Housewood tells Emma and Harriet that Emma's sister Isabella and her family will be visiting them very soon. If you can recall, it was the very outset of the novel. At the outset of the novel in chapter 1, we were told about Isabella, and we were told in chapter 1 and 2 that soon she, her husband and their children would be visiting Highbury to meet Mr. Woodhouse and Miss Emma Woodhouse. Well, important discussion points with reference to chapter 9, volume 1 are as follows. The theme of misunderstanding and self-deception emerges. Once again, Mr. Elton makes a romantic overture that is directed to an ambiguous source. The poem he writes is intended for Harriet Smith's collection, yet he first shows it to Emma, which begins a misunderstanding regarding what it is meant for. The poem is equally confusing in itself. The answer to the riddle is courtship, yet the object of said courtship is described as a witty, intelligent, and beautiful woman, a description that even Emma cannot relate to Harriet. However, since Emma is in a habit of deceiving herself and having her imagination at work all the time, so she tries to believe that this is for Harriet. However, since nothing can be openly declared, both Emma and Harriet must rely on the subtle clues that Mr. Elton gives. As Emma believes in what she likes, so she thinks that the riddle is intended for Harriet. Thus, the theme of self-deception is again highlighted, and we would see that this self-deception of Emma and the misunderstanding regarding the riddle would go a long way to create problems for Harriet and Emma both. As I discussed in the previous session, that Jane Austen as a writer very smartly uses comparisons and contrasts of characters to point out their important personality traits. Here again we can notice a comparison of the characters of Emma and Harriet. Actually, this chapter reinforces the idea that the friendship between Emma and Harriet Smith does neither much good. We are told by the writer that Emma has done little reading since she became close with Harriet. We also come to know that all of the attempts to improve their minds ended with no effect. Furthermore, through the activity of solving the riddle, we are told and reminded by the author that Harriet is intellectually Furthermore, through the activity of solving the riddle, we are told and reminded by the author that Harriet is intellectually inferior to Emma when they attempt to solve the riddle. Harriet gives only absurd answers while Emma easily guesses the answers. This proves a few points. Number one, Emma is an intelligent girl. Number two, it is her intellectual superiority that makes her exhibit her power and dominance over Harriet, who is intellectually also inferior to Emma. Some more discussion points are as follows. As Emma and Harriet decide to share the riddle with Mr. Woodhouse, they read it to Emma's father, who likes it very much, but they keep the author, that is Mr. Elton's name, secret. Mr. Woodhouse talks about Isabella and her visit in this chapter as well. Mr. Woodhouse will be happy to have the boys temporarily under his care because he thinks their father and uncle are too rough with them. However, Emma disagrees and asserts that the boys like the rough housing, as that is the case with us all, Papa. One half of the world cannot understand the pleasures of the other. Here, interestingly, through a comparison and contrast of Mr. Woodhouse and Emma, the father and the daughter, what we notice is that Emma, who generally is a girl who is more inclined towards imagination, she is very rational and logical, and she tries to convince her father that whatsoever he thinks about people may not always be right because half of the world cannot understand the pleasures of the other. Anyhow, to the father, poor Isabella would have a short visit, as have been all her visits since the sad day of her marriage. अब ये फिर उसके father की अपना एक perception है ना, very narrow perception. He thinks because he is not ready, because he is not ready to accept any change, he does not want anybody around him to leave or to go. So mentally he has not accepted Isabella's marriage. That is why he again complains, like he has always been complaining against this situation, and he says that poor Isabella would have a very short visit, and since her marriage she has never ever have been able to have a visit for comparatively a longer duration. And he mentions her day of marriage as a sad day. This is again his own perception, and he is unable to see how people perceive things. This shows a selfish and narrow vision of Mr. Woodhouse that has been evident from the very outset of the novel. अगर आप शुरू में देखें, the same were his comments regarding the marriage of Miss Taylor, who as Mrs. Weston left their place. This leads us to chapter 10 of volume 1. Emma and Harriet make a charitable visit to a poor family outside Highbury. Emma tells Harriet that she never wishes to marry because she would have to find someone superior to herself first. She further asserts that even unmarried she would never be as pathetic as Miss Bates, as she is rich, not poor like Miss Bates. We are also introduced to Jane Fairfax, and we also come to know that Emma dislikes her because she is so highly praised. As far as the relationship between Harriet and Elton is concerned, Emma continues to contrive a romance between Harriet and Elton, though it is yet for us to discover how far Emma is successful in developing this romantic relationship between Harriet and Elton. Well, some important discussion points with reference to chapter 10 of volume 1 are the following. The reason that Emma is unmarried because she is not interested in marriage all these reasons become clear in this chapter. And what are these reasons? She is highly independent, and of course she loves her independence. She is not ready to sacrifice this independence. She will never need to marry because socially she is powerful, she is independent, and she does not need anybody to support her. This leads to the theme of marriage and social security, where most of the women in Jane Austen's England would marry to fulfill the basic need of social security. However, in case of Emma, we are told she, if ever marries, that will be for love. So even in this case, Emma is an exception, since she does not need any kind of social or monetary support or an uplift in social status, because she already belongs to the highest rank of the society. So if ever she decides to marry, that will be for love. This is what she claims. In that case, she should like to find someone superior. Why she would like to find someone superior? Again, this becomes very ironic in the context. We would see how and what happenings are related to this statement in the upcoming chapters. In terms of the development of themes, the theme of marriage and love, and then the theme of class distinction and marriage, they are very much related to this chapter, and they are further reinforced through what Emma perceives about herself and about Harriet is made clear. When it comes to Jane Austen's England, it was the times in which Emma, the novel, is also set. It was the time when love was something that had not much to do with marriage. The purpose of marriage was to enter into a kind of social contract that would provide social security, and for most of the women it would be used as a means to raise their social class or standard. The other theme, that is of class distinction and marriage, is also very much evident through this chapter, through the voice of the author and through the thoughts and actions of Emma and Harriet. What we are conveyed is that marriage has a lot to do with the class. One has to marry either within his or her class or in the upper class to uplift his or her social status. And marrying somebody below or beneath your status is not considered very appropriate. Again, the theme of self-deception and vanity emerges. The introduction of the character of Jane Fairfax gives some dimensions to Emma's vanity. With the exception of money, Jane is presented as Emma's equal in terms of beauty, wit, intelligence, and talent. Emma is unsettled by this competition. She is not very comfortable with this, and her automatic dislike of Jane Fairfax is no doubt linked to some jealousy on her part as well. And later on we would see that this theme of jealousy continues for quite a long time in the novel. When it comes to the discussion points related to chapter 10 of volume 1, I would say that Jane Austen's art of characterization is an important dimension or aspect. Jane Austen contrasts the reputations of Emma Woodhouse and Miss Bates, both of whom are single but are differentiated by fortune. One of them is rich, the other poor. And Emma herself, while giving reasons for her not being interested in marriage, says that if she does not marry, it doesn't matter for her, because after all she is rich and she's not poor like Miss Bates. In addition to providing a contrast to Emma's comfortable life, the characters of Mrs. Bates and Miss Bates serve as comic relief in the novel. Miss Bates chatters on incessantly about any topic, while Mrs. Bates' hearing difficulties result in aggravating the situations, and this brings some humor in the serious narration of the novel. Jane Austen also makes it clear that these women deserve pity and compassion, and this is important to notice that these characters, they are not ridiculed. We can compare this to Fielding, Henry Fielding, and his writing of Joseph Andrews that you have already studied as a novel of this course. You can see where he would be ridiculing, he would be satirizing, and he would be making fun of the characters to exploit human follies. In case of Jane Austen, it is not so. Even if weaknesses of characters are presented, they are not presented to be ridiculed or to be laughed at. They are provided as a comic relief. Yes, maybe this is possible, as in the case of Miss and Mrs. Bates. We find so, but the purpose of Jane Austen is not to prick with the hurting satire as was in the case of Fielding and Joseph Andrews. I think this is an appropriate time to have a look at some part of the text and to share it through the session. So this is some text from chapter 10. The text goes as follows. To fall in with each other on such an errand as this, thought Emma, to meet in a charitable scheme, this will bring a great increase of love on each side. I should not wonder if it were to bring on the declaration. I must, if I were not here, I wish I were anywhere else. Anxious to separate herself from them as far as she could, she soon afterwards took possession of a narrow footpath, a little raised on one side of the lane, leaving them together in the main road. Well, to help you understand this part of the extract, I would give you the background. This is a scene where Emma and Harriet, they are walking on a street, and as they are moving, they are going to Miss Bates' place. Actually, on the way they find Elton. Now, as soon as Emma sees Elton, because in her imagination she always finds Harriet and Elton as a very appropriate match, so she wants to use this opportunity to bring them closer. And she thinks to fall in each other on such an errand as this, to meet in a charitable scheme, this will bring a great increase of love on each side. So she thinks that if such opportunities as this one is provided, it would help them come closer and it would increase love between the two. And she thinks that I should not wonder if it were to bring on the declaration. It must, if I were not there. I wish I were anywhere else. अब उसका दिल चाहता है कि वो खुद वहाँ पर ना हो, काश हैरियट अकेली होती और उसकी एल्टन के साथ मुलाकात हो जाती. Anxious to separate herself from them as far as she could, she soon afterwards took possession of a narrow footpath, a little raised on one side of the lane, leaving them together in the main road. अब वो जानबूझ के अपनी इस शौक में कि वो उनको मौका दे so that they could talk to each other, वो एक छोटे से फुटपाथ के ऊपर चलना शुरू हो जाती है while both of them are walking on the main road. But she had not been there 2 minutes when she found that Harriet's habits of dependence and imitation were bringing her up too, and that in short they would both be soon after her. अब Harriet को तो आदत है, she would always follow Emma. So now, just like Emma, she would also step on the footpath, and Emma soon realized that it would end up having both of them too on the footpath with her. This would not do. She immediately stopped. Under pretense of having some alteration to make in the lacing of her half boot, and stooping down in complete occupation of the footpath, begged them to have the goodness to walk on. अब उसने फिर प्लान चेंज किया है, वो अपने जूते का जो है लेस बांधना शुरू हो गई है और प्रिटेंड करते हुए कि एज इफ उसके जूते का लेस खुल गया है, उनसे कहती है कि दे कैन गो ऑन, दे कैन कीप ऑन वॉकिंग. So, when stooping down in complete occupation of the footpath, she begged them to go to have the goodness to walk on, and she would follow in half a minute. They did as they were desired, and by the time she judged it reasonable to have done with her boot, she had the comfort of farther delay in her power, being overtaken by a child from the cottage, setting out, according to orders, with her pitcher, to fill broth from Halffield. To walk by the side of this child and talk to and question her was the most natural thing in the world, or would have been the most natural had she been acting just then without design. अब तो चूंकि वो एक प्लान के तहत काम कर रही थी, otherwise भी she would have liked to talk to the child. This is what the author says, and by this means the others were still able to keep ahead without any obligation of waiting for her. She gained on them, however, involuntarily. The child's pace was quick. and theirs rather slow, and she was the more concerned at it from their being evidently in a conversation which interested them. Mr. Elton was speaking with animation, Harriet listening with a very pleased attention, and Emma, having sent the child on, was beginning to think how she might draw back a little more when they both looked around and she was obliged to join them. Mr. Elton was still talking, still engaged in some interesting detail, and Emma experienced some disappointment when she found that he was only giving his fair companion an account of the yesterday's party at his friend Cole's, and that she was come in herself for the Stilton cheese, the North Wiltshire, the butter, the celery, the beetroot, and all the dessert. This would soon have led to something better, of course, was her consoling reflection. Anything interests between those who love, and anything will serve as introduction to what is near the heart, if I could but have kept longer away. अब मजे की बात ये है कि Elton and Harriet, they are just talking about common things. Elton is talking about the yesterday's party that he attended, और इसी तरह से Harriet is just talking about common things, her common experiences, which disappoints Emma because she wanted them to fall in love with each other. She wanted them to talk about romantic matters. Now that they are not doing so, she is disappointed. लेकिन फिर वो अपने आप को ये कह के तसल्ली देती है. She consoles herself by thinking that anything interests between those who love, and anything will serve as introduction to what is near the heart. कि कोई बात नहीं, अगर वो एक दूसरे से मोहब्बत करते हैं तो जो भी बातें करें that would be fine. So she wishes that she could have kept longer away. काश वो इतनी जल्दी उनको join ना करती, but anyhow she has joined them. There are some further happenings in the chapter that we are doing right now, that is chapter 10. Coming back from the house of Miss Bates, Emma and Harriet meet Mr. Elton. Emma tries her best to leave the lovers alone, with little success. Finally, she fell behind and broke off her bootlace so that the three could have a chance to go inside the house. Once inside, Emma and the housekeeper were in one room fixing her lace, while Emma left those two alone again. To Emma's disappointment, they took no advantage of this opportunity. However, she believes that the day was not a total disaster, and though Mr. Elton seems cautious, Emma guesses the pair will soon be together. This brings us to chapter 11 of this volume. The visit of Isabella that had already been hinted upon in the previous chapter takes place now. Now that Emma's family is soon to arrive at Harfield, she is obliged to leave Harriet and Mr. Elton to their own selves for a while. She has more important matters to attend now, and it is the family's first visit in many months, as they had spent recent holidays by the sea. So Emma, of course, has to make a lot of arrangements to welcome them. Mr. Woodhouse again expresses his anxiety both on the subject of such bathing trips and on the long distance the family had travelled. But again, this is Mr. Woodhouse's characteristic trait, and he is in a habit of complaining all the time, so this is usual for him to do so. As Mr. John Knightley and Mrs. Isabella Knightley visit Mr. Woodhouse and Emma at Harfield, we notice that Mr. John Knightley is a good and clever man. On the next slide, actually, we would read some text about him. Well, here I would like to make it clear to you that George Knightley and John Knightley are brothers. If you can recall, George Knightley we have been talking about since the very beginning. This person, John Knightley, is the husband of Isabella, the elder sister of Emma. Anyhow, Mr. John Knightley puts up with his wife's ways of handling Mr. Woodhouse. Actually, Emma feels him to be too rude and overbearing to her father. She thinks that he does not deal with Mr. Woodhouse with patience. Ab Mr. Woodhouse ko to aadat hai, he would all the time be complaining. So when irrationally, illogically, he would just be making complaints, while Emma and Isabella would treat him in a different way. Mr. John Knightley would treat him in a completely different way. He would not show, according to Emma, not show any patience, and he would try to look at things logically. Mr. John Knightley tries to talk Mr. Woodhouse out of his illogical fears or complaints. The topic switches to Frank Churchill anyhow. Again, we notice the difference of opinion in Emma and Mr. John. He disapproves of how the boy lives away from his father. He suggests that Mr. Weston did not mind much, being too used to the lush life of a bachelor. Emma is angry and he dislikes his comments but keeps quiet because she does not want to spoil the family relationships. As I said earlier on the previous slide that we are going to share some text regarding different characters. So here we have some text about Isabella, and we would share some text about Mr. Knightley, and we would see how as a couple they go along. So this is some text from chapter 11 that is about Isabella Knightley. Mrs. John Knightley was a pretty, elegant little woman of gentle, quiet manners and a disposition remarkably amiable and affectionate. Wrapped up in her family, a devoted wife, a doting mother, and so tenderly attached to her father and sister that, but for these higher ties, a warmer love might have seemed impossible. She could never see a fault in any of them. She was not a woman of strong understanding or any quickness, and with this resemblance of her father, she inherited also much of his constitution, was delicate in her own health, over careful of that of her children, had many fears and many nerves, and was as fond of her own Mr. Wingfield in town as her father could be of Mr. Perry, the doctors. These are the doctors respectively of Isabella and Mr. Woodhouse. They were alike too in a general benevolence of temper and a strong habit of regard for every old acquaintance. So what we come to know about Isabella is that she is a soft-spoken, quiet-mannered woman who is a typical devoted wife and mother who loves her children but who overcares them, who is overcareful about her own health, about the health of her children. She is delicate. Unlike her sister Emma, we can draw a comparison and contrast with Emma here. She is not very strong, she is not very powerful, she is not also very active, and we do not also find the quickness in her as we find in Emma. Rather, I would say that she is far closer to her father in terms of her habits and constitution than to her sister Emma. Well, dear students, here is an extract again from chapter 11, and this text is about Mr. John Knightley that would provide us a character sketch of Mr. John Knightley. Mr. John Knightley was a tall, gentlemanlike and very clever man, rising in his profession, domestic and respectable in his private character, but with reserved manners which prevented him being generally pleasing and capable of being sometimes out of humor. He was not an ill-tempered man, not so often unreasonably cross as to deserve such a reproach, but his temper was not his great perfection, and indeed with such a worshipping wife it was hardly possible that any natural defects in it should not be increased. He had all the clearness and quickness of mind which she wanted, and he could sometimes act as an ungracious or say a severe thing to Isabella. So in comparison and contrast, when we look at Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley, that is John Knightley and Isabella Knightley, what we come to know is that they are poles apart. They are completely different from each other. What is very much wanting in the personality of Isabella, that is her lack of clarity, her lack of quickness, her lack of power and energy, all these things are very much present in the personality of Mr. Knightley. On the other hand, whereas Isabella is very submissive and very soft-spoken, we find that Mr. Knightley is, because of his reserved manners, we are told, he is not very pleasant and sometimes he is capable of being out of humor. Here is another extract of the selected text from chapter 11 that is about the relationships. The relationship of Mr. Knightley with, that is John Knightley, with his sister-in-law Emma, with Mr. Woodhouse, with Isabella, etc. He here means Mr. John Knightley. He was not a great favorite with his fair sister-in-law, nothing wrong in him escaped her. She was quick in feeling the little injuries to Isabella, which Isabella never felt herself. Perhaps she might have passed over more had his manners been flattering to Isabella's sister. But they were only those of a calmly kind brother and friend, without praise and without blindness. But hardly any degree of personal complaint could have made her, regardless of that greatest fault of all in her eyes, which he sometimes fall into, the want of respectful forbearance towards her father. Then he had not always the patience that could have been wished. Mr. Woodhouse's peculiarities and fidgetiness were sometimes provoking him to a rational remonstrance or sharp retort equally ill-bestowed. It did not often happen, for Mr. John Knightley had really a great regard for his father-in-law and generally a strong sense of what was due to him, but it was too often for Emma's charity, especially as there was all the pain of apprehension frequently to be endured, though the offence came out not. The beginning, however, of every visit displayed none but the properest feelings, and this being of necessity so short might be hoped to pass away in unsullied cordiality. So what we are told is that Emma is not very much pleased by the way John Knightley treats her father, that is Mr. Woodhouse. However, again, on both the sides, that is Mr. John Knightley, who would most of the times be acting as a brother and a friend, without praise and without blindness. On the other hand, Emma would also use all her cordiality to let things go as smoothly as possible so that the relationships are not disturbed. Some important discussion points and themes that emerge from the events of Chapter 11, Volume 1 are the following. Theme of propriety. Well, John Knightley's pointed remark about Emma's marital status is yet another reminder that Emma has more power as a single woman than a married one. While Emma often seems petty and self-centered in her dealings with Harriet Smith and Mr. Knightley, here she reveals herself to be more honorable, letting her brother-in-law's rude comments about Mr. Weston's social activities pass in order to keep the peace. She behaves with propriety. Once again, Jane Austen uses manners or propriety to defend or define the value of each character. The first descriptions of Mr. John Knightley and his wife mention their manners. While Isabella's manners are acceptable, her husband's are too reserved to be pleasing, and he is too judgmental towards others' behavior, for example, towards the illogical behavior of Mr. Woodhouse. He criticizes Frank Churchill. He has an argument with Emma, who finds him rude. As discussed earlier, we find him less patient towards Mr. Woodhouse. Theme of propriety is highlighted again when the story of Frank Churchill is told, foreshadowing that he will soon play an important place in the novel. We are told that he has not visited recently. The fact that he has not yet visited his father since his marriage is presented as a clue to something related to propriety. However, since there is every indication that he has proper manners, there must be a reason that why he has not visited Highbury. So, appropriate manners that suit a particular class is one of the major themes of the work. This leads us to Chapter 12 of Volume 1. Emma wants peace for family's sake, so she decides that Mr. George Knightley must dine with them upon his brother's visit. As I have already told you that Mr. John Knightley and Mr. George Knightley are brothers. Now Mr. John Knightley, as he is there with his family, so Emma plans that Mr. George Knightley, who is a frequent visitor otherwise, he should come to dine with them. She wants to use this opportunity as a means for reconciliation over their argument about Harriet and Mr. Martin. Despite the fact that she has no plans as such to concede the argument, she wishes to restore their friendship. Mr. Woodhouse again exhibits his peculiar temperament. He objects and criticizes the travelling of Isabella's family. He also criticizes London as unhealthy, but Isabella denies this. When he says that Mr. Knightley looks ill, her husband gets cross and asserts that she should not treat him like a child. And on this behavior of Mr. John Knightley, Emma is shocked, and she does her best to smooth over their tempers. Now conversation takes a turn and they start talking about Jane Fairfax. Isabella just hopes for a visit from her, but since the daughter of her benefactors, Mr. and Mrs. Campbell, have recently married, the family is unlikely to let their only companion leave. So in near future, maybe there are no chances of the visit of Fairfax. However, it is again Jane Austen's art of writing that she has well before in time introduced the character of Jane Fairfax. During the conversation anyhow, Isabella mentions Jane Fairfax as equally accomplished and superior as is Emma, and as a more suitable companion to Emma than Harriet Smith. The reaction of Emma towards this is very interesting because she feels jealous because so far Jane Fairfax is the only person who is considered to be equal to her in manners and in accomplishment. So she is not very much pleased with this. From chapter 12, three important aspects that I would like to share are the following. Number one, appropriate and perfect manners of Emma. Number two, positive aspects of Emma's personality. And number three, Jane Austen's art of characterization, where again a comparison and contrast of Emma and Jane Fairfax is made. Well, coming towards the first point, that is appropriate and perfect manners of Emma, I would say Emma, despite the numerous faults, has a near faultless sense of politeness and decorum. She always exhibits proper manners. She will not admit that she was wrong concerning Harriet Smith and Robert Martin. But her stubbornness is not enough to stand in the way of her friendship with Mr. Knightley, and she would behave very politely in a very, very appropriate manner. Talking of the positive aspects of Emma's personality, I would say while Isabella and her husband travel a great deal, Emma admits that she has never even seen the ocean. Now it even sounds strange to us as a reader that Emma admits something. Her father never travels, which is to be expected considering his anxiety over his health, but it is peculiar that Emma never leaves Highbury when there are numerous instances when other characters do travel often. Perhaps Emma never leaves Highbury because there is no need. She is happy, contented and satisfied. She enjoys all the power that she wants to enjoy in Highbury. She has everything she desires there, or perhaps she does not want to leave her father alone. But whatsoever the reason, she admits that she does not very frequently go out. Whatsoever the reason may be, but she admits this, as I said earlier. Another important point that I would like to discuss is with reference to Jane Austen's art of characterization. Again, using the same technique, she has drawn a comparison and a contrast of Emma and Jane Fairfax. We again and again find references to Jane Fairfax, and they foreshadow the importance of Jane Fairfax in the upcoming events in the following chapters. Her talents and bearing make her a continual aggravation to Emma. Emma is used to be superior, be the only queen. Austen contrasts the ideal Jane Fairfax with her, who would be Emma's intellectual match. And in comparison and contrast with Harriet Smith, she is far more intellectual, whereas Harriet Smith would always be there only to flatter Emma. Significantly, only Mr. Woodhouse, who refuses to think badly of his daughter under any circumstances, thinks that Harriet is a perfect friend for Emma. With this, we move on to chapter 13 of the current volume. In this chapter, what happens? Let's see. Mr. Weston invites members of Highbury society to dine with his family at Randall's on Christmas Eve. So the Woodhouses and Knightleys are invited too. Mr. Elton is also included. Although Harriet Smith too is invited, she cannot attend because of a cold and sore throat. Emma meets Mr. Elton while visiting Harriet, and she is pleased by his attention to her friend. However, she is unhappy that despite her suggestion not to attend the party since Harriet will not be there, Mr. Elton still resolves to attend. अब एमा को तो ये लगता है ना कि एल्टन हर उस जगह पे जाता है जहाँ पर हैरियट होती है. अब उसको लगता है कि if Harriet is not there, so he should not attend the party. But she is unhappy to see that Elton decides to attend the party. Mr. Woodhouse also attends the party despite inclement weather that would usually force his absence. However, as usual, he is irritated, unpleasant, and anxious. Emma is displeased that Mr. Elton seems unaffected by Harriet's absence and he is enjoying himself. Emma and Mr. Elton travel to the gathering in the same carriage. She is also surprised at his overly familiar manner in addressing her. Mr. John Knightley witnesses the exchange and suggests to Emma that Mr. Elton has feelings for her and seems infatuated with her. Amused, Emma dismisses the suggestion, however. Again, the theme of self-deception emerges through what happens in chapter 13. Emma's self-deception about Elton is over, you would notice. In this chapter, Emma finally realizes that Mr. Elton has no interest in Harriet Smith and is instead infatuated with Emma herself, though she says to Mr. Knightley that this is not so. Like his brother, Mr. John Knightley also serves to shatter Emma's delusions, but in his manner he differs sharply. While Mr. Knightley is more considerate, polite and well-mannered, Emma's brother-in-law, that is John Knightley, is more abrupt and direct, and Emma interprets it as rudeness. Again, the theme of class consciousness is an important theme in the chapter. When Emma realizes that Mr. Elton is interested in her, her opinion of him worsens considerably. What she thought in him perfect for Harriet now seems to be inappropriate for herself. She starts noticing his flaws. She now has objection that he is too eager to please when it concerns women. जो अपने लिए उसको बात अच्छी लग रही है वो उसको हैरियट के लिए अच्छी नहीं लगी, और जो हैरियट के लिए उसको बातें ठीक लग रही थी अपने लिए she doesn't like that. This shows a flaw in the character of Emma. As we move on to chapter 14, we see that they attend a party in this chapter. The party that they are invited to, entering the party, Emma attempts to put Mr. Elton's strange behavior out of her mind. During the party at Weston's, Mr. Elton continually attempts to be near Emma. On the other hand, she still hopes that she can fix the situation in Harriet's favor. However, ironically, Elton's constant attention and hovering presence makes her worry that maybe Mr. John Knightley's observation that Elton is interested in her is true. अब उसको फिक्र होना शुरू हो जाती है. Again, because Mr. Knightley is the rationality and the voice of reason in the novel, so if he says that Elton seems to be interested in Emma, maybe it would come true, and the same is what Emma fears now. Anyhow, during the party, Mr. Weston announces that Frank Churchill is due to visit in early January. If you remember, Mr. Frank Churchill, who is the son of Mr. Weston from the first marriage and who was sent to their relatives to be brought up, he has been talked about a lot and he is a source of curiosity in Highbury. And now we are told that after a long time he is going to pay a visit. Emma finds herself interested in this news because she, though not very seriously, thought of Frank as a potential suitor. अब despite her claims कि वो कभी शादी नहीं करेगी, somewhere, however deep in her heart, she thinks that maybe Frank is a suitable match for herself. However, at the same time, she does not anticipate giving up her vow to remain single. There is some conversation between Emma and Mrs. Weston. That is Miss Taylor, who is now Mrs. Weston. She tells Emma that she has some anxiety about meeting her stepson. She is not even sure whether Mrs. Churchill will prevent him from coming, or he would visit them. As they discuss all this, Emma wonders why a young man should be so dependent upon the impulses of his guardian. And why Emma wonders so, I think we can understand that very clearly. A young woman like Emma, who is in such a position of power, and who is in such a control of whatsoever happens around her, for her it is difficult to understand so much dependency of Frank Churchill on his guardian. Some important discussion points with relation to Volume 1, Chapter 14 are as follows. 1. Jane Austen's art of characterization. Number 2, theme of manners and propriety. And number 3, the theme of marriage. So we'd start with Jane Austen's art of characterization. Again, we notice that Mr. Elton and Mr. Knightley are brought in comparison and contrast. At the Westons' Christmas party, Emma finds Mr. Elton too eager to please her. On the other hand, she feels that Mr. John Knightley is completely unwilling to do so. And the contrasting behaviors actually highlight the impact of the behavior of each of these. An important theme that emerges in this chapter once again is that of manners and propriety. Though Emma has started disliking Mr. Elton, she still makes a conscious effort to remain civil to him and to behave well. Again, she demonstrates her best manners and bears Mr. Elton's irritating attitude without making a mistake in etiquette, as she is very conscious of manners with reference to the projection of class. Theme of marriage is again pointed out. Once again, the theme of marriage is highlighted, and for the first time in the novel, we notice that Emma considers marriage for herself. Before this, she has always been claiming that she would not marry and she would remain single. Again, marriage, social class and love are to be seen in connection. For Jane Austen, Emma serves as a mouthpiece to mention that no matter how far independent and wealthy you are, marriage is to be considered in practical terms. A rich, independent and powerful woman like Emma thinks of age, character and social status for match in marriage. There is no mention of love as such again, as I discussed previously. Emma decides that Frank Churchill would be a suitable husband before even meeting him because he belongs to the upper class. She already knows what she needs to know: his age, his status and his family connections. These are the three things that would make a suitable match according to Emma, and this is what she knows even before she meets Frank Churchill. So she is all convinced that he is the most suitable husband if she would be interested in marriage. With this, we move on to chapter 15 of this volume, and in this chapter we see that during the party, Mr. Elton joins Emma in the drawing room. Emma dislikes his over-interest and over-concern about Emma's health. She wants him to think and be concerned about the health of Harriet. Meanwhile, Mr. John Knightley announces that it has begun snowing. This creates some confusion, concern, and in fact a kind of small crisis. And of course, we can understand that most of the part of the crisis is created by Mr. Woodhouse, who is already very much concerned about his health, etc. Anyhow, by the end of the visit with the Westons, Mr. Woodhouse is in a very bad mood and he fears that they will be unable to leave Randalls. We notice that Mr. Woodhouse and Isabella both are over-concerned about how they would go back home, though it is only about traveling 3/4 of a mile to reach home. Again, when we compare Mr. Woodhouse and Isabella, we find them of the same temperament, and Emma is in very contrast to them. Mr. Knightley assesses the situation again very logically and reassures everyone that they will be taken back home safely. Soon the snow subsides, carriages are brought and guests leave for home. The chapter continues, that is chapter 15 continues. Emma finds herself in the same carriage as Mr. Elton, who takes this opportunity to express his love for her. Now it is not by chance, maybe it is by design on the part of Mr. Elton that he and Emma are alone in the carriage. Hoping that he is merely drunk, Emma tries to remind him that Harriet is the true object of his love. However, Elton does not listen to her. He expresses his surprise at all this and assures Emma that he has never been interested in Harriet. He also degrades and rejects Harriet for her low social status and reminds Emma that he only spent time with Harriet when Emma was near. By this, what he implies is that he is interested in Emma and he spends time with Harriet only as a means to be near Emma. He also asserts that Emma has known of and encouraged his sentiments. Emma is appalled by this revelation and actually he is very much angry on the claim that he makes. She expresses her anger over the proposal and immediately rejects Mr. Elton. For the rest of the journey, both remain silent and angry before they reach back. Well, in terms of plot and character development, this chapter is very, very important. When it comes to plot and structural development, we have seen that a crucial crisis situation appears where Elton and Emma are alone in the carriage and Emma is very much displeased with the advances of Elton. As far as the themes are concerned, the theme of social class and snobbery is an important theme with relation to chapter 15. This chapter provides insights into the social life in Jane Austen's England. Upper-class people are snobbish enough to make claims that in a light snow they cannot walk back home. Travel, even between two relatively close estates, say of not more than 3/4 of a mile, can be troublesome to them if conditions are not perfect. Isabella, as a representative of this class, asserts that she finds it unthinkable to do. This shows snobbery on the part of all the characters belonging to this particular class. In the same way, Elton's quick dismissal of Harriet as not of his rank shows a petty snobbery. The theme of social class and marriage is also entertained in this chapter. Emma rejects Mr. Elton on the same grounds of social class on which Elton rejects Harriet. And if you remember, same grounds were used by Harriet to reject Martin. It also reminds us of Emma's rejection of Robert Martin on the same grounds as a match for Harriet. So this all is very ironic, of course. Well, we need to look at Emma's character at this time point in the novel. Emma's confrontation with Elton in the novel is the first major crisis. The true turning point is not Mr. Elton's proposal, however, but his accusation that Emma has known that she was the object of his affections all along. Rather, he claims that Emma had been encouraging him. He asserts, "I'm sure you have seen and understood me." Interestingly, for the first time, we find in the novel that Emma is at a loss for words. For the first time, we find her fiercely angry. This is the first instance also in which Emma is implicated in the social interactions that she believed she was manipulating from a position of control and detachment. Her self-deception is challenged. She is also accused for knowingly doing all this. And for the first time, she realizes that she is also seen through the same lens as other people are seen. When it comes to Austen's writing style, I would say that she is a master of projecting ideas. When it comes to depicting emotional scenes, Austen is not very powerful, maybe. However, there is another viewpoint on this, that she preserves the privacy of her characters. Whatsoever may be the case, the reality of her writing style is that she generally switches from dialogue to indirect language when relating moments of passion. Instead of reporting Elton's speech directly, बजाय कि Elton और Emma के direct dialogues देती, what Austen has written is, Mr. Elton had actually begun making violent love to her, availing himself of the precious opportunity, declaring sentiments which must be already well known, hoping, fearing, adoring, ready to die if she refused him. From this statement and from what we know of Mr. Elton, we can imagine his actual words, but their shock value is softened by the indirect description. The information Austen gives us about Emma's feelings is similarly vague. It would be impossible to say what Emma felt on hearing this, which of all her unpleasant sensations was uppermost. Anyhow, we have some text here where actually Emma not only rejects the proposal of Mr. Elton, but also reminds him that his true object of love is Harriet Smith, and if he is interested in giving some message for her, she would definitely take that. Let's see what the text says. Emma says, "My friend, any message to Miss Smith I shall be happy to deliver, but no more of this to me, if you please." Miss Smith, message to Miss Smith, what could she possibly mean? And he repeated her words with such assurance of accent, such boastful pretense of amazement, that she could not help replying with quickness, "Mr. Elton, this is the most extraordinary conduct, and I can account for it only in one way. You are not yourself, or you could not speak either to me or of Harriet in such a manner. Command yourself enough to say no more, and I will endeavour to forget it." However, Mr. Elton does not agree to what she says. The text continues, "Good heaven," cried Elton. "What can be the meaning of this? Miss Smith? I never thought of Miss Smith in the whole course of my existence, never paid her any attentions but as your friend. Never cared whether she were dead or alive, but as your friend. If she has fancied otherwise, her own wishes have misled her, and I am very sorry, extremely sorry. But Miss Smith, indeed, oh, Miss Woodhouse, who can think of Miss Smith when Miss Woodhouse is near? No, upon my honour, there is no unsteadiness of character. I have thought only of you. I protest against having paid the smallest attention to anyone else. Everything that I have said or done for many weeks past has been with the sole view of marking my adoration of yourself. You cannot really seriously doubt it, no." So what we notice is that Mr. Elton is emphatic about his viewpoint, that all that he did and all that interactions he had with Harriet, they just had one purpose, and that was to be, number one, close to Emma, and number two, to please Emma. Now that we have noticed in chapter 15 that Elton has rejected Harriet on the grounds that she is far low in status, in this chapter, that is chapter 16, we notice that Emma comes back to Halffield. Emma is back at Halffield after her carriage journey with Mr. Elton. As she looks back over the past weeks, she is bitter. She feels miserable that she was so deceived by Mr. Elton that she failed to recognize his true motives. Her biggest regret concerns Harriet, whose feelings for Elton, Emma realizes, are mainly due to Emma's own encouragement. She also thinks now that the situation is entirely her fault because she tried to meddle in Harriet's and Mr. Elton's affairs. She decides that she does not need to pity Elton because the artificiality of his addresses suggests that he was more interested in her wealth than in herself. In the heart of her heart, she admits that both of the Knightley brothers have been right about Mr. Elton, and that she has been wrong throughout in understanding Elton. After this bitter experience anyhow, Emma vows to give up matchmaking, but she cannot stop herself from searching for a new suitor for Harriet. अब पुरानी आदत है ना, तो जाते जाते ही जाएगी. Though she makes a claim that she would not make any matches again, she takes an exception on this, and she plans to find a possible good new suitor for Harriet. Several days of snow provide a respite as everyone stays at home. However, Emma knows that sooner or later this would be known to Harriet, and she dreads telling all this to Harriet. Before we move forward, I would like to share the opening text of chapter 16. And it would show how miserable Emma felt at all that. The hair was curled and the maid sent away, and Emma sat down to think and be miserable. It was a wretched business indeed. Such an overthrow of everything she had been wishing for. Such a development of everything most unwelcome, such a blow for Harriet, that was the worst of all. Every part of it brought pain and humiliation of some sort or other, but compared with the evil to Harriet, all was light, and she would gladly have submitted to feel yet more mistaken, more in error, more disgraced by misjudgment than she actually was, could the effects of her blunders have been confined to herself. If I had not persuaded Harriet into liking the man, I could have borne anything. He might have doubled his presumption to me, but poor Harriet, how she could have been so deceived. He protested that he had never thought seriously of Harriet. Never? She looked back as well as she could, but it was all confusion. She had taken up the idea, she supposed, and made everything bend to it. His manners, however, must have been unmarked, wavering, dubious, or she could not have been so misled. So mainly we find a couple of things about Emma. She is very much disturbed. She is very much miserable because of what Elton has done. However, a very positive aspect of Emma's personality is highlighted here. She is miserable for herself and for what has happened to her, but she is more miserable for what has happened to Harriet. And she is on her journey, on her way to disillusionment. She has started realizing that it was she who pushed, who forced, and who encouraged Harriet to like Mr. Elton. And she considers herself responsible for all that Harriet would have to face in the case of this rejection. She looks back in retrospect at all that has happened. She tries to find how far Elton was right when he said that he was not interested in Harriet, rather was in herself. And actually there is all confusion, and she cannot, through looking at what he did, his conduct, his manners, she cannot find a clear picture of what has happened. With reference to chapter 16, some important themes emerge. The most important theme here for me is the theme of guilt. Emma is upset about Mr. Elton's behavior for various reasons, but one strong reason, as I have said earlier, is that she feels herself responsible and answerable towards Harriet, and her conscience pricks her for pushing Harriet to be interested in Elton. Two more themes that are interconnected and interrelated are also found. One is theme of social class uplift, and the other is of social class consciousness. As far as the theme of social class uplift is concerned, among Emma's objections to Elton and his proposal is the fact that his devotion to her is largely fiscal and for financial purposes. So he so desperately wants to move up in society and perceives marriage to Emma as the ideal opportunity. This is what Emma thinks. This needs to be contrasted to Emma's own efforts to match Harriet with Elton and to reject Martin for the same grounds or for the same reason. And after all, Emma has done all the same, and she has rejected Martin for Harriet. She has tried to make a match of Elton and Harriet for the same reason of the social uplift of Harriet. As far as the social class consciousness is concerned, Emma feels insulted that a person of Mr. Elton's social status would consider himself fit for her. This demonstrates some arrogance and vanity as well as snobbery on her part. She thinks that Mr. Elton is too low for her, but she finds him good enough for her close friend Harriet. She dismisses Mr. Elton because he does not come from a reputable family, the same reason that he rejects Harriet Smith. So why she is angry then if he rejects Harriet Smith? Also, the qualities that Emma finds objectionable in Mr. Elton, that he is proud, assuming, conceited, very full of his own claims, these are the very qualities that she tries to inject in Harriet to raise her social status. I think this is the time point when we need to look at the character development of Emma. When we look at the character of Emma, we think of a few things. There are newfound signs of maturity in her. She accepts the blame for the situation. She realizes her error of judgment in terms of matchmaking of Elton and Harriet and misunderstanding Elton. She agrees that both Mr. Knightley and his brother were correct in their analysis of the situation. So for the first time ever in the novel, we find that she steps out of her self-deception and her illusions, and she tries to face the reality. This takes us to chapter 17, and in this chapter what we find is that Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley return to London. Mr. Elton writes Mr. Woodhouse to announce that he will spend the next few weeks in the town of Bath. Listening to this news, Emma is relieved. She thinks this is the appropriate time to visit Harriet. In fact, she wants to take this as an opportunity to, I'm sorry, this 2 is a typo error, OT की बजाय यहाँ पर TO है. So an opportunity to explain all this to Harriet. Harriet responds to the news with a lot of modesty, respect and love for Emma. This sweetness of the temperament of Harriet in taking the news gives Emma the temporary impression that Harriet, rather than herself, is the superior creature. She moves Harriet to Harfield. There she spends time with Harriet in her attempt to help Harriet forget Elton. Emma also knows that one day Elton would come back and Harriet and he would face each other, so she tries to prepare Harriet for the inevitable moment when they will see Elton in their social circle after he returns from Bath. A couple of things are evident about Emma. She understands what she has done wrong, especially what she has done wrong to Harriet. She wants to rectify that. She wants to find a good suitor, a new suitor for Harriet. She also, as she tells the news to Harriet, she is happy to see, she is comforted to see that she listens to it with a kind of sweetness, and she thinks she is responsible for all this. So she takes Harriet to Hartfield, where she spends time with Harriet. She helps her forget Elton. And also, not only to forget Elton in terms of a suitor, but also she tries to prepare Harriet. She thinks it is her responsibility to prepare Harriet that when Elton comes back finally from Bath, she could face him. In chapter 17, an important aspect is Jane Austen's art of characterization. Austen uses the same technique as a writer again. She compares and contrasts two characters, that is of Emma and Harriet here. However, this comparison and contrast is carried out in a different manner than she has at early points in the novel. A lot of development in the character of Harriet is shown. Earlier we were told that Harriet is gullible and foolish. Emma, on the other hand, is distinguished from her through making it clear that Emma has status, fortune, wit and talent. Now, however, we come to know that Harriet Smith is unspoiled and has a sincere and pure heart. I hope you can remember that she was disappointed when Martin's proposal was rejected. In retrospect, we can also see Mr. Knightley had already warned about Emma's influence on Harriet, where he had said that it would do no good to any of them. This leads to the disillusionment of Emma. This contrast between Emma and Harriet causes Emma to question her own value. And for the first time in the novel, Emma questions her own thoughts, perceptions and actions. For the first time, she begins to realize that she may lack some quality. This takes us to chapter 18, that is the last chapter of volume 1. And this is also the last chapter for our today's session. In this chapter, what we find is that Frank Churchill's visit was due since long. However, he does not make his expected visit. This leads to the disappointment of Mrs. Weston in particular. If you remember, she had already apprehensions that he might not be allowed to visit. Emma, preoccupied with her own worries, does not mind, but she feels she must express disappointment so that she will appear her usual self. Again, theme of manners and mannerism comes in. It is about propriety, about proper manners. Now the warmth with which she expresses it leads to another misunderstanding. She has an argument with Mr. Knightley about the young man. Mr. Knightley expresses the same thought Emma has expressed. How can a 24-year-old man can be prevented by his aunt from doing his duty? In reply, Emma suggests that Knightley is a poor judge of the difficulties of dependence. She expresses her sympathies for Frank's situation and her conviction that he would come if he could. But Knightley counters that no sensible, honorable man would be prevented from doing his duty. The argument that Emma and Mr. Knightley have regarding Frank Churchill is very important. It shows on one hand Mr. Knightley's prejudice against Churchill, who is still a stranger to him. On the other hand, Emma's unnecessary favor of Frank Churchill, as she predicts that Frank, when he does arrive in Highbury, will be perfectly charming. बगैर उसको देखे ही उसको ये सारी बातें लगता है कि यूं होंगी. Knightley believes that Frank will be superficial and insufferable. Here what we notice about Mr. Knightley is that unusually he is not logical here, and he assumes that Mr. Frank Churchill would be superficial and insufferable. On the other hand, Emma, as usually she does, she is again on the basis of her imagination thinks that Frank would be a perfect charming man. Some discussion points with reference to this chapter are as follows. Without having met Frank Churchill, Emma has already decided that he is a wonderful person. When she quarrels with Mr. Knightley about Frank, she automatically assumes that Frank has good intentions and is perfectly honorable. Mr. Knightley, however, in contrast, suspects Frank Churchill to be lazy and dishonorable. Since Mr. Knightley tends to echo Austen's own voice and predict character flaws, his objections must raise some doubt about Frank Churchill. However, we are not sure at this time point. Whatever influence that the Churchills have on Frank, he is still a grown man and can make decisions for himself. The Churchills can only do so much to prevent him from visiting his father. Once again, the issues of social status and decorum are important considerations. Mr. Knightley assumes that one of the Churchill's great mistakes with Frank is making him believe that he is above his actual connections. He is too proud, luxurious, and selfish for his status in society. Frank Churchill therefore joins Harriet Smith and Mr. Elton as characters chastised for not knowing their proper place in society. We have already seen Harriet, we have seen Elton going through the same processes. In addition, Mr. Knightley claims that Frank Churchill may lead a disreputable life dedicated only to the pursuit of pleasure. In other words, he does not behave with the sense of honor and decency that a man of his situation should. Discussion points so far are that till this point we notice that Emma seems to have gained a measure of understanding, but the narrator has provided hints that she has more to learn through the future events. She grows in terms of disillusionment, humility and selflessness and self-realization, but there is a lot more that she needs to learn. She is more and genuinely concerned about Harriet now. Apart from her increased self-understanding, Emma shows an increased understanding of Elton's character as proud, assuming, conceited, very full of his own claims and little concerned about the feelings of others. This is what she can see for the first time. However, Emma has not yet been able to overcome her former shortcomings completely. For example, though she generally claims that she would not make any more matches, she still is interested in finding a new suitor for Harriet. Emma's resolution to cease matchmaking is put in terms that suggest that she has gained a good deal of insight. She herself thinks it was foolish, it was wrong to take so active a part in bringing two people together. It was adventuring too far, assuming too much, making light of what ought to be serious, a trick of what ought to be simple. However, soon she forgets all this and she's imagining new matches for Harriet, as we see. These are the references and the materials that I have incorporated in this, and with this I take you to the summary of today's session. As I have said earlier, this session has covered chapters 9 to 18 of volume 1. So by finishing today's session, we have actually completed volume 1 of the novel. Important happenings in these chapters are covered, and critical points of discussion are highlighted. Some important extracts of text with reference to the development of characters are analyzed. I have also talked about Jane Austen as a writer and have discussed her art of characterization. Development of different themes as they emerge at different points through these chapters is also discussed. And of course, I have given some comments on the writing style of Austen. I hope by the end of volume 1 you have been able to understand not only the writing style of Jane Austen and her grip over her writing, but also you have been able to understand the development of different characters and themes as it takes place through volume 1. With this, I put an end to the session. We close it. Thank you very much.